Definitely advanced us on the recording. Whoop, don't do that. All right, so good morning again to everyone, and we're in Acts chapter 10. All right, so we've started the section on holiness, how Christianity diverged from Judaism and came to be defined as what it is, what we now think of as Christianity, what the world thinks of as Christianity, or what the world should think of as Christianity. What's its definition? And we're in the section on holiness. What is the Christian concept of holiness? How does it differ from the Jewish one? And of course, by Jewish, you understand nowadays there's sort of denominations of Judaism like there are of Christianity, but not quite the breadth. There aren't quite as many. When we think of Judaism of this sort, we're thinking more of what you might call Orthodox Judaism. The Gentiles, sometimes refer to ultra-Orthodox Judaism, and so do Jews use the terminology too. But ultra-Orthodox. So we did an interview, right, on our podcast, and we interviewed an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, although when I asked him about the terminology before we did the interview, he said, yeah, we don't call ourselves ultra, that doesn't sound ultra-Orthodox, wasn't invented by them. But they're going to be, I think, these are people who are pretty much view the Old Testament as inspired more or less similarly to the way Christians do. And of course, not all Jews hold that position. And he told me that he thought the Jewish population was the most secular minority in America, the most secular. And he said that his view is that the secularization of the culture has been led by Jews, that they've brought a mentality in the world. So this is, he's of course a rabbi, and over at where is it off Overton? It's Knesset. Is it Knesset? Is that? Yeah, Knesset. Yeah. Very interesting interview. If you haven't heard it, we talked about the Messiah, and they are very much still believe the Messiah is coming, that he will be the son of David, and that his kingdom will never end. But he is mortal. Not that he will die, but that he's a human. He won't die because God will reform the world. There'll be a whole new type of world, and he won't die, but he will reign forever. It's interesting. Sure, yeah, of course, yeah. Well, that's what I was saying. They're reading, the prophecies about Messiah in very similar ways. All right. So, anyways, the definition of Christianity as regards holiness, and last week we talked about the pair of stories about Aeneas and about Tabitha or Dorcas. The one was paralyzed and the other a gazelle. And we talked about holiness and how holiness relates to good works. These people were saints. One of them couldn't do any work because that was the limitation placed on him by his paralysis. And when God restored his legs, which is part of what holiness means, it means to restore a person to the way God designed you originally in creation. To be holy is Holy, is to be whole, Whole. And then that meant, in the first place, he could take care of himself. Real holiness means taking care of yourself. We tried to instill this, didn't we, in our children when they were younger. Well, do we stop? We don't stop. We keep telling them this. And then every once in a while, you get the mirror in front of your face and you realize you're as much of a wreck as they are, but you're older. It's even less excusable. But them taking care of themselves. Every once in a while, I'm telling one of my children something that's sort of basic, and I'm saying it in the tone only a parent can. It's kind of half teacher, half parent. This is so obvious a snail could see the truth of this. And then you realize, oh, I haven't done that. I got to make sure I do that, whatever thing. And then of course, Dorcas, who did all this work, she used her legs really well for God. And what holiness meant in her case was that in the resurrection, she was literally raised from the dead, not in the ultimate sense that's coming at the end of history. This was just a little foretaste of what that ultimate resurrection will be. That her resurrection, as she woke up from the dead, she found all these widows she had done her works for, there to receive her. And the value of all that work she had done, and then there on display all the clothes she had knitted and so on. The work she had done sort of welcomed her into the new life. So little lessons on holiness and the value of holiness. We need that reminder, don't we? We said last week I think it was after everybody had left, I should have probably said this before while we were during the lesson, but I had a good friend because when you talk about holiness, ultimately you mean you're a servant of all. We don't just mean we stay away from bad things. We mean we actively do good works. So the first two stories here are about good works. And most of the time when people think of being clean or holy, they think of it in terms of avoiding bad things, which is true. That is holiness, avoiding unclean things. But there's a positive side to holiness, which is proactively doing good works. We separate ourselves from the world in that we love our neighbor. The problem is that when you start doing good things for other people, they just get used to it. So we started doing a breakfast on Fridays. So now this I realize this may stir up controversy for this group. But anyway, one of the groups decided to do breakfast, and somebody volunteered to make the breakfast. And I said, "Are you?" Well, no, it was a volunteer job. So I said, "Are you sure you want to do that? Because what's going to happen is 3 breakfasts into it." I've done this before. I've made breakfast for that group. What's going to happen, right? The gratitude is gone, and it's nothing but expectation at this point. And now it's just a question of whether it meets the standard you want it to each week. So what I was saying last week to the group that was left here is something a friend of mine would say to me, which is, you'll know you're a servant when people treat you like one. So that's the moment you realize you've truly become a servant, because now they're treating you like a servant. But of course, what we really want as Christians, if we're honest, maybe this is just me, is I want to be known for being not known. Like, I want to be famous for being not famous. I want to be noted and celebrated and lauded for being the person who doesn't seek that. It's like when you were young and you were like, if I were rich, I'd be different from all the rich people. Like I wouldn't be like these people. All right, so so this was about good works, and what good works ultimately mean and our value. All right, so let's get to Peter. He's on this little journey, and he went off to the coast to Lydda, and then he ended up in Joppa where he raised Dorcas. And then now word comes from Caesarea. It's a little missionary journey, and then it'll eventually end up back in Jerusalem. So for chapter 10, verse 1, at Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius. Wait, I'm not sharing this with people. Hold on. All right. There was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian Cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror and said, What is it, Lord? And he said to him, Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa, and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea. Simon was a very popular name. When the angel spoke to him and departed, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him, and having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. All right, so let's just stop there. The opening paragraph. First of all, if you haven't been to Israel, I highly recommend it. It's great to go see Joppa. And I am planning to go if you want to go with us. But we take very small groups to get your names in soon. So maybe not this coming spring, we're going to Greece this spring, but the following spring or fall, I guess. Let me think. It'd be spring of 2023. Maybe probably spring of 2020. Plus, it gets us far enough away, hopefully, from COVID. The theory is COVID at some point won't be an obsession. Yeah, you mean like in the fall? You mean? Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. Well, we'd be a little after it, but yes, it's obviously a pretty exciting time. And well worth the trip. But Caesarea, was a Roman city. Obviously, its name says Caesarea. It sounds like a mall in Texas, kind of like Texaria. Isn't that something you'd see in Texas? Yeah. Sorry, no offense to the Texans. I lived in Texas for a while. But it was mainly a Gentile city, mostly Gentiles living there. So that's a problem right off the bat, because we know up till now, Peter has visited some cities that are Jewish and has visited some Jewish people who were followers of Jesus, had become followers of Jesus. So no controversy there. But when Cornelius, who is a Gentile, he's a centurion, he's a Roman soldier in charge of 100 people, and he's also a God-fearer. So he would attend synagogue, and he would offer charity to the Jews, and he believed in Yahweh, and would go and listen to their teaching. So most likely, being in Israel, he heard their ideas about God. Not that he had never heard them, being a Roman, but being in Israel, he probably saw the temple and so on. And so it was attractive to him. Okay, and this is not totally surprising. There were other Gentiles that got attracted, because what was the temple in Israel? It was the place of the witness for God, the temple of testimony, as it's called in the Old Testament, or the tabernacle of testimony. And we saw the Ethiopian eunuch earlier in chapter 8 traveling to Israel to witness the worship of God. And so you can imagine having the pagan religions and some of the barbarism associated, where you have temple prostitutes and many gods that are at war with one another. The stories, in the Iliad, even the Greek philosophers were very critical of Homer for his depiction of gods in the way they are in his story, the Iliad or the Odyssey. So Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, they were very critical that you can't think of gods being like this. And actually, there would only be one God anyway. There's not multiple gods. And so they said things that, if you were smart, you might have picked up a little bit in the culture, in the education and so on, among the philosophers. And who knows? Anyway, he was attracted to the idea, and he was a convert, to belief in God. And he did lots of good things. And the interesting thing is the vision he sees of the angel. What the angel says to him is, your prayers and your charity, your alms, have come up before God as a memorial. Now, Christians are correct to point out, as we often do, Jesus did anyway, that our works are not what we don't earn God's mercy by doing our works. Jesus told a very famous parable of a guy who was a Pharisee, went up into the temple and said, "Oh God, I am so thankful that I'm not like these other people. And I do this, I give alms, I tithe, I do all these works." And then Jesus showed, the tax gatherer who came up and just bowed his head, beat his chest, and said, "Just be merciful to me, God, a sinner." And Jesus said, that guy went to his house justified. God declared him righteous because he knew righteousness was a gift. Whereas the Pharisee thought, he was like coming to his heavenly boss saying, "Hey, I sold this much product, and I did this, and I earned this money." So Jesus himself declared this, that works are not the basis on which we have any kind of right status with God. We're not at peace with God because of the good works we've done. And I think you all know, if you ever even heard the name Billy Graham, that Graham when he was preaching. But this is kind of an interesting story, right? Because probably most Christians, if they're encountering people who are clearly non-believers, they don't believe in Jesus Christ, they're probably not going to say, to them, "Hey, your good works are really valuable to God. God has noted your good works," right? Because they would think, well, if I say that to them, then they're going to think, "Yeah, see, I did all these good works. Even as a non-believing atheist, I did all these good works, and God is going to, in the end, be kind to me. It doesn't matter really whether I believe in him because I did all these good works. And really, in the end, isn't that what God wants anyway?" So, I know some Christians that are rogues. So I'm better than those people. So Christians probably aren't going to do that, right? So how do you explain this story? Yeah, we're here to collaborate and think together. So does anybody have an explanation for that? Why did God send an angel to commend Cornelius for his good works when that sort of might confuse the gospel of salvation, which is you're not saved by good works? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so we should do the same thing then?
Someone knowledgeable that's talking to an atheist might commend them for doing such good works and then lead them on to in their faith towards the truth of Jesus Christ.
I really like this answer, right? You can't really go wrong when you say, well, it's right here, so probably there is a role for doing that. But
Bill, could you please repeat it? I couldn't really hear it over my computer. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So Jane's answer was that she said there probably is a place for us. If say I was interviewing, talking to an atheist, to or anybody for that matter, to commend somebody for good works that they do. She was just saying there probably is a place for that as a starting point. That's obviously good that they're doing that. There's nothing, right? So that's something to be commended. Of course, God would. That's much better than being a criminal. Yeah. Yeah. So Anne Marie's saying that so you couldn't hear her. Is that right, Janine?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just repeat the answers real quickly. That Anne Marie's saying, in the case of Cornelius, of course, God knew his heart, that he wasn't really doing his works as a way of pleasing God, like that. Hey, that means now I've earned salvation. God knew that, so his commendation to him wasn't muddying the waters in that sense. I suppose it's probably worth noting a little bit, like the context. Like where, as used to Anne Marie's point, where is Cornelius? Like, What do we know about Cornelius, his attitude, who he is, and why might God even mention this? Like, what's the point even of mentioning it? Couldn't this story have worked just fine without mentioning it? And secondly, does any of this have to do with holiness? Because the stories around this part of Acts seem to be about holiness. So that would be a question I would have, is how does God commending him for his alms in some way relate to that idea of holiness? So you got two questions there. You can take either one.
May I answer or
Fire
try?
away. Yeah. Fire away.
I'm thinking that says that Cornelius is a Roman. He's not a Jew, and so this is a sort of an opening of the religion that was at first very Jewish, and we began to see other people who are not Jewish coming into the fold. And that would be part of the context, is because he's Caesarea was a fortification and a port city, right? And heavily secular.
And very Gentile. So, yeah, I think that what you've done is just describe the context really well. This is about sort of opening the door to Gentiles, and in a sort of even geographic way, it's sort of a fitting, as a port city and so on, a sort of fitting example of that. But then what's the part about, how does that connect to commending him for his alms, that they've ascended as a memorial before God?
Not only does this talk about acts of charity, but also his prayers.
Yeah, it talks about his prayers as well. Yeah. Hold on a second. Yeah.
Well,
yeah, that's true. Hold on, Diane speaking. Go ahead.
Understanding the one true God, which would lead him more towards maybe belief in God's Son.
Yeah, right. So that's a good point. You've got to transfer what he has belief in God, in Yahweh, but not in his Son. Right? That's ultimately what this is a bridge toward belief in Jesus as the Son of God. So that's true. And Janine, you added about, what'd you say? Or I think it was Janine.
I said God loves everyone.
So that's going to be a big part of the story, right? God loves everyone, Jew and Gentile. And on what basis, though, does he love them? Because they do good works?
You keep going back to that, but, I see there's continual prayer.
Janine, you just garnered a lot of laughter in this because they all realize it's about time someone put Bill in his place. So
you want me to mute myself?
No, definitely not. But I know you won't be surprised by this. I'm going to come right back at you. It turns out I didn't write this. It's Luke who's recorded for us at the beginning of the story that God is commending Cornelius for his works, his good works. So I'm just asking, why did God do that?
I think he's trying to point out that that Cornelius is just as holy in his devotion to God, or actually so, than some of the Israelites.
So Anne-Marie's saying that maybe the point is that God's trying to teach Cornelius that his good works are as valuable, more valuable maybe even, than Jews, by saying this to him. And what is that about holiness? That would be at least one explanation. Yeah. So it's commending him for like true holiness, kind of a thing. Yeah. And so you're a non-believer and you can be more holy than. Yes. He's kind of an interesting case, right? because you can't really say he's a non-believer, can you? Because we've already been told he genuinely fears Yahweh, God. And so he really believes in God. And one of the proofs of that, right, is that when Peter shows up at the end and he hears the message about Jesus, that faith he has in God, he transfers to Jesus. Do you remember a famous statement Jesus once made to the disciples? When they were struggling over a similar thing, they believed in God. This is in the upper room. And he says to them, you believe in God. What's the next line? Believe also in me, meaning in the same way you trust God and believe in God, you need to trust me and believe in me. That was sort of a transfer, or at least an addition, I guess maybe you would say. So that was difficult for them. And now in the similar thing has to happen with Cornelius. So I think to me, this is sounding more and more satisfying. I think we're sort of over the target zone. I don't know if we've quite put our finger right on the target, on the pulse. I mean, but it feels like we're a lot over. So one of the things I do feels like a pretty good question. I mean, sometimes I have questions, lots of questions. And then I discovered later, it wasn't a very good question. I just thought it was, sometimes you convince yourself you have a really good question, and it's kind of hard to admit it wasn't really that good of a question. I mean, because God never answers it. But that doesn't mean it's a bad question, by the way, but it means there's no point in keep thinking about it because God doesn't solve it. But in this case, I'll say maybe I'll just kind of keep reading and then go through the whole story, which is sort of what you were starting to do, right? And Janine was doing this too, is I'll just kind of really go through the whole story, and then maybe I'll come back to this and see if I can fit it in as a piece of the puzzle later as to how it fits. Because sometimes you're just at the beginning of the story and something's raised and you're not quite sure. You're not quite sure, where it's going to go and how is this going to work out. And you might look at it a little differently later in the story. Okay, so let's try and do that. So we'll just kind of put that question on the shelf. And
Bill, may I say something there?
Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, I was just thinking here, Cornelius was, he was Roman in a city where they worship all sorts of pagan gods, and he was the different one. He was definitely the different one in that he put aside his pagan religion and feared the real Jehovah God. So there he was. In a sense, he was an outsider in a city where he was different in that sense, that he feared the one true God.
Yeah.
So,
that's superb.
What about the phrase? What about the phrase Italian cohort? A cohort would be a member of a group.
Yeah. That's right. It's a military term, right? It's the name of the cohort.
Right.
Yeah, it's the Italian cohort. It's the name of it's a military cohort, like a regiment. Yeah, it's like the name of the regiment. Because the Roman Empire was cosmopolitan, right? Very culturally diverse. So, maybe being a part of the Italian cohort, is a little bit like saying you're actually Italian. You're not just from Spain or Gaul. The Frenchies, as they sort of, is that the way they would call them? The Galli. They made fun of them when they'd come down to Rome because they wore pants. Instead of togas, they wore pants, like where they had legs, what we call pants. A couple of, they'd come and walk through Rome and giggle at them because they're wearing pants. Anyway, we'll come back to it. I think to me, these are really good answers. But we might come back to it and put it in a little bit in the sort of context of one or two other things. And so he sent these men then to Joppa, of course, where Peter was. And having related everything to them, verse 8, he sent them to Joppa. And let's see. Yeah, so Peter's in Joppa. Does that mean anything to anybody? It's funny
That's where Jonah. That's where Jonah.
yes, that's where Jonah was. You remember Jonah, the story of Jonah? That's where Jonah was. He was in Joppa. Do you mind if I tell you a little bit, remind you about the story of Jonah? Jonah was told to go to, maybe you can help refresh my memory. Who was he told to go preach to? You want to remember? Well, they weren't a bunch of Jews, right? We know that. They were Assyrians, they're up in Nineveh. So to Nineveh, right? And they were a bunch of Gentiles, right? And what was Jonah's reaction? No.
He said east. He said west, not east.
There you go. Yeah, he went down to Joppa and he got on a ship and he went in the opposite direction. Okay, so he said no. What's the story about here about Peter? What's he going to be told to do? Go. He's going to be told to go up to the house of Cornelius, who's a Gentile. Do you think Peter is going to go to the house of Cornelius? Because he's a Jew, you can't go and eat a dinner at a house of a Gentile. And so when God sends him the vision and says, "Rise, kill, and eat," which is to teach him the lesson about, Peter says, "No." Like Jonah did. He won't go off to Gentiles. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what God has made clean, do not call common. Yeah, the reason is because when Peter responds, he says, "By no means, Lord." And some have interpreted this because the language is in the New Testament usually is a reference to Jesus as Lord. And so they take this as a vision of Jesus himself appearing to Peter. And that's why it's in the red letter. It's sort of funny that we, obviously the original Bible wasn't red lettered, but it's sort of funny, like, why don't we red letter everything God said in the Old Testament? Or do we? I don't think so. But we have Jesus' words in red. Kind of interesting, isn't it? So, because one of the whole points of Jesus' ministry is that everything he said was what God said, and what God said was what he said. Whatever. So Joppa, anyway, and then Jonah didn't want to go off to Gentiles. He didn't want to go off and preach mercy to Gentiles, and especially the nasty Assyrians who had wreaked so much havoc on Israel. And so what happened is he got on a ship and he took off toward the west, as Janine said. And what happened? Nothing good. I think we've been there, done that, right? Went the opposite direction from where God was pointing, and then things didn't work out so well. So what actually happened? He got on the ship, and then they started sailing, and what happened?
They came upon a storm.
Yeah, first a storm overtook them, right? And Jonah was down in the bowels of the ship, and he came up and he said, "You just got to throw me overboard." Yeah, like he knew right away, this is God, which we've all had that, where this is God's, in whatever way, letting me know this isn't right. And in his case, he just knew. He didn't even take God speaking from heaven. It was a storm. And the interesting thing is he said, "Just throw me over." What kind of a reaction is that? I mean, what does he mean?
Heavy guilt.
Yeah, but heavy guilt, but not repentance.
He was doing it to
Not
save the
repentance.
other people, right? He was being
No,
generous.
well, I mean, he's saying, throw me in. Yeah, you'll say, but he doesn't, the point is, he'd rather die than repent and go off to the Assyrians.
Yeah.
He will not go there. Now, let's just think, what should his attitude have been? What if you were a Jew living in his day? Obviously, God had spent a lot of effort teaching the Jews to separate themselves from Gentiles. Okay, we'll talk more about this in a little bit. But why, like, on what grounds should he have known? Should he have been more amenable to the idea? You know, like, of course, I should have a desire for God to show mercy to Gentiles. You know, why would a Jew be thinking that? Or was this a whole new lesson? No Jew ever would have known this prior to Jonah, and Jonah's the first time God ever teaches them. Yeah, and what's the exact wording, and where does it come from? You got the idea, right? The Jews are to be a light to other nations, but there's an exact expression God communicated to Israel, and when he did it is pretty important. And it relates to the nations. I'll give you the exact line. All the families of the earth is the exact line. Or all the nations of the earth, depending on your translation. Anyone know where that is? All the nations of the earth will be blessed in what? Does ring a bell for anybody? This is when God first spoke to Abraham at the very first interaction God ever had with Abraham. It's the very creation of Israel. And God says to Abraham, I'm going to bless you. And in addition to you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. That's your role as a nation. It's as fundamental to them as we the people. Or, what's that?
Maybe the Jews thought, oh, we'll just be perfect. Everybody look at us and bless us.
Yeah, sound familiar, yeah.
So they
Ever heard the expression life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Like we know that, don't we? We ought to read it every July 4th. We ought to. We need to read it more. We have these expressions that trickle down through history to us, and they're defining expressions. Give me liberty or give me death. You know, you say that in this region of the world, right? Because it's come down to us as an expression that encapsulates what supposedly, purportedly we stand for. It's part of our history. So for Israel, what God said to Abraham is one of those kind of stock phrases. So that's your attitude. God is using us to bless all these other nations. But Jonah had drifted, as much of Israel had, far away from that attitude. And of course, Jonah wasn't himself a rebellious, disobedient Israelite. He was himself a prophet who was obedient to God. And it was the rot of the attitude that had gotten skewed was in the very prophet. Right? It's not good when the very leaders, are guilty of a violation of the quintessential thing you do. I was having coffee with a pastor. Okay, this is a few weeks ago. Genericize this as much as possible. And I was telling him a little bit about going to some of the atheist conventions. And I said, it's interesting because we're the only Christian there. I'm the only Christian there that I know. There's no other Christian group there for sure. And there's got to be hundreds of apologetics organizations in this country, Then there's a gazillion ministries, on top of that. And it's sort of weird that like you'd think there'd be like people trying to knock on the doors all the time, trying to get, because this is one place, there's a bunch of unbelievers, it's not, that's their identity, is to be anti or atheist, So, and he said, yeah, I'm just not interested in that. I wasn't telling him to go, or I wasn't telling him something to do. I wasn't even, the things I'm saying to you, I wasn't even saying to him. He was just asking me what I do. And I said, oh, well, I do this thing. And he said, yeah, I just wouldn't be interested in that. And I was like, what do you mean you wouldn't? Like, I mean, I get, like, it's not that every Christian has to go there, per se, but what do you mean you're not interested in that? And it's like, I just, those kind of people, I'm just not interested in talking to. You mean the people who don't believe? Because I feel like there's this really important thing Jesus told us at the beginning of the church age, which was for everybody, which was go and make disciples, which I think means they're not disciples yet, and then you make them disciples. No, because I usually don't just say to people, that sounds disobedient of Jesus' direct command. I usually don't say it to people. I know I don't usually just treasure that when people say it right to my face. So, but I just thought that's not good. That's not good. I wasn't even trying to convince him of anything. I just am saying it was just not good. So my point is, Jonah was, in his mind, was like, I'm not interested in being a blessing to those Gentiles. So I'm going to go the opposite direction. And he'd rather die out in the ocean than go to the Syrians. And what happened? He said, just toss me into, God's upset and I don't want to finish it. Just toss me into the water and you'll be fine. And what happens next? No, that's not what happens next. Anyone remember? It's the turning point of the entire story for Jonah.
They threw him in and the sea calmed.
It's before that.
Okay.
What's that? Not quite, although they did do that. But what happened was the Gentiles refused to toss him into the water. Now you think about that. The Gentiles cared more about his life being spared than he cared about the life of the Gentiles in Assyria. Not good. Not good. So, of course, the storm kept coming. They were going to drown. And Jonah threw himself off the ship. Threw himself off the ship. But you see, now the attitude has changed. Jonah has been humbled, and he's throwing his own life off the ship to save them. That reminds me of another story. I know of another story of a guy who threw his life into the grave so that others could be saved. And that would be a great analogy for the cross, wouldn't it? But then guess what happened to Jonah? Now you know. Now you really know what happened. Is God helped him keep being obedient? He helped him. Sometimes we need help to keep being obedient. So he sent the fish and he rescued Jonah. So he didn't actually die. Jonah didn't. Jonah thought he was dead. In Jonah's mind, keep in mind, he really does think he's dead. And God spares him, sends the fish, saves his life, and then the fish ends up over on the coastline by Assyria. outside, the closest you can get to Nineveh by Antioch. And wow, that's interesting, Jonah says. That's interesting that I would be dropped off right here. Hint, hint, Jonah. And what happens? Jonah obeys because he's been changed. And that was 3 days and 3 nights. And he came out of the fish and was there alive on the land. That'd be a great analogy, wouldn't it? That Jonah died, gave his life to save these Gentiles. And then 3 days later, he comes out from the dead, because everybody would have thought he was dead. And there he is alive. I think Jesus made reference to the story, didn't he? But he wasn't just saying it was an analogy to the resurrection. It was also an analogy to the cross. That he gave his life. So Jonah was relearning a lesson that he already should have known. All right. Now we get to Peter. And what is his lesson going to be? And unfortunately, I need to close and get over to class. So you get a week to think through what Peter's lesson is. And if I might offer a little hint, that when Peter preaches, when Peter gets into the house of Cornelius, we're going to learn directly from him what the lesson was. So if you're wondering, in the next paragraph, verses 9 to 16, what's the lesson of the sheet? Keep reading. And listen to what when he gets into the house, and then pay very close attention to the summary Luke provides you of his sermon. And see how much of that might reflect what the lesson is from this. And does any of it, in the end, does it help us understand why God commended Cornelius for his good works? That might, see if that gets resolved in some way, all right? So there you go. You have a week to think and to read for yourself. All right, so let's close this out. Let me close in prayer.